The door to the executive office slammed shut with a force that made the glass walls tremble, and every sound in the corridor seemed to die at once as Ethan Parker stood frozen just inside the room, his hand still hovering near the handle. Victoria Reynolds turned the lock herself, a sharp, deliberate click that echoed like a verdict, then lowered the blinds until the city skyline vanished behind strips of shadow. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply stood there, the most powerful woman in the company, her posture rigid, her jaw tight, her perfectly controlled world threatening to crack at the seams. Ethan had faced board meetings, layoffs, and deadlines that could ruin lives, but none of them had prepared him for the way her eyes looked now, dark, unguarded, almost afraid. He opened his mouth to ask why he was here, to remind her that he had a meeting in 10 minutes and his son waiting for him at daycare. But she stepped closer before he could speak, close enough that he could smell her perfume and feel the tension radiating from her skin. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves could betray her. "I'm pregnant." The words were soft, almost fragile, yet they hit him harder than any shout ever could. The room tilted. Time slowed. Ethan felt as though the careful structure of his life, every early morning, every packed lunch, every promise he had made to keep things simple and safe, had just been ripped away. His mind raced backward, 3 months into the past, to a night he had sworn to bury forever, a night he had labeled a mistake because it was easier than admitting it had felt real. He had been drunk on exhaustion and loneliness then, on the strange relief of being seen as something more than a widower and a single dad, and Victoria had been someone else entirely, tired, human, vulnerable in a way no one ever believed she could be. That night had ended with silence, with an unspoken agreement that it would never follow them into daylight. Now daylight had caught up. Ethan's first instinct was to run, not from her, but from the future that was suddenly pressing in on him from all sides. He thought of his son's laugh, of the way Noah trusted him completely, and fear wrapped itself around his chest until breathing felt like work. Victoria straightened as if bracing for impact, her expression hardening even as her hands trembled at her sides. And in that moment, Ethan understood that this was not just her confession, it was a challenge. Outside that office, the company demanded perfection and obedience. Inside it, a fragile truth threatened to destroy them both. As Ethan met her gaze, a single question thundered in his mind, louder than the door slamming shut. Would he do what he had always done and protect his small, fragile world by walking away? Or would this be the moment he finally stood still and faced the consequences of one night that refused to stay buried? Ethan didn't remember leaving Victoria's office. He remembered the air feeling too thin, his ears ringing, his heart pounding as if it were trying to escape his chest, but the details blurred together until he found himself sitting in his car in the underground parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The engine was off. The dashboard was dark. Minutes, or maybe an hour, passed without him noticing. "I'm pregnant." The words replayed again and again, each time landing with the same crushing weight. He had spent years building a life that revolved around control. Predictable mornings, carefully planned evenings, routines that kept his grief from spilling into the present. As a single father, he couldn't afford chaos. Chaos took people away. Chaos had taken his wife. And now, chaos had just whispered his name from the lips of the woman who signed his paychecks. When his phone buzzed with a daycare reminder, reality snapped back into place. Noah. He turned the key, pulled out of the garage, and drove through the city on autopilot, the familiar streets suddenly foreign, as if he were seeing them from someone else's life. At pickup, Noah ran toward him with the same unfiltered joy he always did. Backpack bouncing, smile wide and trusting, and Ethan forced himself to smile back even as guilt tightened his throat. He lifted his son into his arms, inhaled the scent of crayons and soap, and wondered how a child could feel so solid while everything else felt like it was dissolving. That night, after dinner and homework and the bedtime story Noah insisted on hearing for the 100th time, Ethan sat alone on the edge of the couch, staring at the muted television without seeing it, his mind drifting back to the night he had promised himself would never matter. It had been the company gala, a night of polished speeches and expensive wine, a celebration of numbers and growth that meant nothing to him beyond the overtime pay it justified. Victoria had stood on stage then, untouchable, commanding the room with ease, but later he had found her alone on the balcony, heels kicked off, city lights reflecting in her eyes as she confessed how tired she was of being strong. They hadn't planned anything. That was the lie he had clung to. One conversation became another, laughter softened into silence, and for a few stolen hours they were just two lonely adults forgetting the rules. In the morning, reality had returned with brutal efficiency. She was his boss. He was an employee with a child depending on him. They hadn't spoken of it again, and Ethan had convinced himself that was proof it had never really existed. Now proof stood between them, alive and unavoidable. The next morning at work, everything felt different. Victoria avoided him, or maybe he avoided her. He couldn't tell. Meetings dragged on, every word loaded with double meaning, every glance from a coworker feeling like suspicion. When she finally summoned him late in the afternoon, the tension was so thick it felt physical. She didn't sit behind her desk this time. She stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the city below as if drawing strength from its relentless motion. "I didn't plan to tell you like that," she said without turning around. "But I can't do this alone." Ethan swallowed, choosing his words carefully, terrified of saying the wrong thing and shattering something fragile. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, hating himself the moment the question left his mouth. She turned then, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and fear. "I've taken 3 tests. I've seen a doctor. This isn't a misunderstanding." Silence fell again, heavier than before. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he wasn't doubting her but himself, his ability to be anything more than what he already was. "What do you want from me?" he asked at last. Victoria exhaled slowly, some of the hardness leaving her expression. "I don't know," she admitted. "I know what the company will do if this gets out. I know what the board will assume. And I know what it will do to you." The fact that she cared about that surprised him more than anything else. For years, he had seen her as a force of nature, someone untouched by consequence, but now he saw the cracks beneath the surface. "I won't force you into anything," she continued, "but I won't hide forever either." That night, Ethan lay awake long after Noah had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling as rain tapped softly against the window. He thought about responsibility, about how easily one choice could rewrite the future, and about the fear that had followed him since the day he lost his wife, the fear of failing the people who relied on him. Walking away would be easy. He could pretend this was her problem, her world, her consequences. But when he pictured the future, he saw more than boardrooms and headlines. He saw a child who might one day ask why his father hadn't stayed. As dawn crept into the room, Ethan realized that the balance he had fought so hard to maintain was already gone. Whether he ran or stayed, the truth had changed everything. And for the first time since becoming a single father, he understood that doing the right thing might cost him the very life he had built, but doing nothing would cost him far more. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of restraint and tension, each morning beginning before dawn as Ethan packed Noah's lunch with mechanical precision, smiled through breakfast conversations about spelling tests and dinosaurs, then drove to work with his stomach knotted so tightly it felt like hunger and nausea fused together. At the office, Victoria became a study in distance, professional to the point of coldness, issuing directives through assistants, avoiding one-on-one meetings unless absolutely necessary. Yet every time their eyes accidentally met across a conference table, Ethan felt the same jolt of awareness, the same unspoken weight pressing down on them both. Rumors began the way they always did, quietly and without a clear source. A pause in conversation when he entered the break room, a glance held half a second too long, whispers about favoritism and tension at the top. And although no one said anything outright, Ethan sensed the scrutiny sharpening around him. He had worked too hard to be invisible to enjoy this kind of attention. One afternoon, as he was leaving early to pick up Noah, his manager pulled him aside with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes and reminded him that commitment during this quarter would be carefully evaluated, and Ethan nodded, understanding the subtext clearly enough to feel anger simmer beneath his fear. That night, after Noah was asleep, Victoria called him for the first time since her confession, her voice controlled but tired, asking if they could talk somewhere neutral, somewhere not watched by glass walls and security cameras. They met at a small cafe on the edge of the city, the kind of place where no one looked twice at 2 exhausted adults hunched over mugs of coffee, and for a moment they sat in silence, the normalcy of the setting almost surreal. Victoria broke first, admitting she hadn't slept properly in weeks. that every board meeting felt like a performance she was no longer sure she could sustain, and that the knowledge growing inside her made every risk feel magnified. Ethan listened, surprised by how natural it felt to simply be there, to offer quiet reassurance without solutions, and when she asked about Noah, about what kind of father he tried to be, something in his chest loosened just enough for honesty to slip through. He told her about the fear that guided every decision, about how losing his wife had taught him that stability was an illusion, and how fatherhood was less about certainty and more about showing up even when he was terrified. Victoria watched him with an intensity that felt almost painful, and when she reached across the table to take his hand, he didn't pull away, even though he knew how dangerous that small gesture could be if seen. The illusion shattered days later when an email from Human Resources summoned Ethan to a routine review, a phrase so carefully vague it might as well have been an accusation. Sitting across from two unfamiliar faces, he answered questions about his performance, his availability, his interactions with senior leadership, every word chosen carefully, his heart pounding as he realized how easily this could be turned against him. When he left the room, he found Victoria waiting in the hallway, her expression tight with restrained fury, and for the first time he saw the limits of her power laid bare by corporate procedure. That night, their conversation was sharper, edged with frustration and fear. Ethan insisting he wouldn't let her sacrifice herself to protect him, Victoria snapping that she refused to watch him become collateral damage because of her choices, until the argument dissolved into exhaustion and a shared understanding that neither of them truly knew how to navigate what lay ahead. The pressure followed Ethan home, seeping into moments he tried desperately to keep untouched, and when Noah asked why he seemed sad all the time, the question nearly broke him. He found himself standing in the kitchen long after bedtime, staring at the quiet apartment, realizing that the life he had built around avoidance was no longer sustainable. The breaking point came when the board announced a restructuring review, a move that everyone understood as an excuse to remove liabilities, and Victoria confided that she had been advised, unofficially, to distance herself from potential distractions if she wanted to maintain confidence. Ethan recognized the threat immediately, felt the old instinct to disappear rise up inside him. But something had changed. Instead of relief at the idea of escape, he felt anger, not just for himself, but for the implication that responsibility was something to be hidden. Their next meeting was not quiet or careful. It was raw and necessary. Ethan told her he wouldn't pretend this didn't matter, that whatever happened he wanted his children, present and future, to know he hadn't run when things became inconvenient. Victoria pushed back, listing consequences with brutal clarity. Public scrutiny, loss of trust, damage to the company they both relied on. But as she spoke, her voice wavered, and Ethan understood that her fear mirrored his own. In that moment, the power dynamic that had always defined them dissolved into something fragile and equal. Two people standing at the edge of a future neither had planned. The decision wasn't made all at once. It grew slowly, shaped by late-night conversations, by the realization that secrecy was eroding them from the inside, by the growing sense that the cost of silence was already too high. When Ethan finally sat Noah down on a Saturday morning and tried, in simple words, to explain that sometimes adults made complicated choices and had to face new responsibilities, he braced for rejection and confusion. But Noah surprised him by listening quietly, then asking if that meant there would be another baby to teach how to build Lego towers. Ethan laughed through tears he hadn't expected, understanding in that instant that courage didn't mean certainty, only presence. By the time Victoria informed the board that she would address her situation on her own terms, Ethan knew the fallout would be severe, but he also knew that the fragile balance he had clung to was gone forever, replaced by something far more terrifying and far more honest. Whatever came next, judgment, loss, or transformation, would be faced in the open. And as the future closed in around them, Ethan felt the unfamiliar weight of resolve settle into his chest, steady and unyielding, carrying him forward into consequences he could no longer outrun. The fallout began quietly, almost deceptively so, as if the world itself were drawing a slow breath before the storm. The board scheduled a closed-door meeting, calendars across the executive floor suddenly blocked with vague placeholders, assistants whispering behind polite smiles. And by the time Victoria walked into that room, every instinct she had sharpened over years of leadership told her the decision had already been outlined, if not fully made. Ethan was not invited, but he felt the tension anyway, a low hum under his skin as he tried to focus on spreadsheets that no longer seemed connected to real life. When the call finally came from her late that evening, her voice was steady in a way that frightened him more than panic ever could. She told him the board had framed their concern as risk management, a sanitized phrase that translated into pressure to announce a temporary leave to present the pregnancy as a personal matter requiring distance from day-to-day operations, and to identify any conflicts that could undermine investor confidence. She didn't need to explain what that meant for him. By the next morning, Ethan's inbox filled with meeting requests and follow-ups that dissected his role with surgical precision, questions about reporting lines, and project ownership that felt like rehearsals for erasure. He found himself defending his work history with a calm that surprised even him, refusing to resign preemptively, refusing to apologize for competence. Yet every conversation left him more drained than the last. At home, Noah sensed the strain despite Ethan's best efforts, growing quieter, more watchful, and one night asked if they were going to have to move again, a question that carried echoes of past losses Ethan had hoped his son would never remember. The question cut deeper than any corporate threat, and Ethan realized that no matter how carefully he tried to shield Noah, fear had a way of seeping through cracks he couldn't see. As weeks passed, the company's posture shifted from cautious to cold, and when an internal memo announced a temporary leadership adjustment, the subtext became undeniable. Victoria would remain CEO in title, but her authority would be diluted, filtered through committees and oversight structures designed to box her in. Instead of anger, she felt a strange clarity settle over her, an understanding that this was the cost of choosing transparency over convenience. She and Ethan met late one night in her office, the same room where everything had begun, and for the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not loudly or dramatically, but with quiet tears that traced lines down her face as she admitted how much she feared losing control, not just of the company but of her own identity. Ethan sat with her, offering no solutions, only presence. And as she leaned into the silence, he felt the shift fully take hold, the transformation from something accidental into something deliberate. The next blow came when HR informed Ethan that his position was being reevaluated due to structural changes, a phrase that barely concealed its intent. And although he argued, documented his contributions, and appealed through proper channels, the outcome felt inevitable. When he was finally offered a severance package framed as a generous opportunity, he declined without hesitation, insisting on a formal review. Even his friends quietly warned him that resistance would only harden the outcome. The process dragged on, a bureaucratic limbo that mirrored the emotional uncertainty weighing on him, and in the midst of it all, Victoria made a decision that shifted the narrative entirely. Against the advice of her legal team, she addressed senior leadership directly, acknowledging the pregnancy without scandal or apology, stating clearly that it did not compromise her judgment or her commitment, and that she would not allow responsibility to be treated as a liability. The statement sent shockwaves through the company, dividing opinion sharply, and while some praised her honesty, others closed ranks, calculating risks and preparing contingencies. Ethan watched from the sidelines as her courage became a catalyst, and for the first time, he saw the story move beyond their private fear into something larger, something that challenged assumptions far beyond their control. At home, the strain reached a breaking point when Noah overheard a tense phone call and later asked in a small voice whether his father was going to disappear like his mother had. Ethan held him then, tighter than he ever had, and promised with a conviction born of desperation that he was not going anywhere, that families changed, but they did not vanish, and in that moment he understood that the fight was no longer abstract. The turning point came when the board formally requested Ethan's resignation, citing perceived conflicts that threatened operational integrity, and something inside him hardened. Instead of panic, he felt resolve sharpen into purpose, and with Victoria's support he refused, requesting transparency and mediation, knowing full well that the choice could cost him everything he had built. The standoff escalated quickly, drawing external attention and scrutiny the board had hoped to avoid, and as the situation edged toward public exposure, alliances shifted in unpredictable ways. Colleagues he had barely known reached out in quiet solidarity, while others distanced themselves with careful neutrality, and through it all, Ethan discovered a resilience he hadn't known he possessed. As the pressure mounted and consequences loomed, he stood at the edge of a future stripped of guarantees, yet anchored by a certainty that surprised him. Whatever the outcome, he would face it openly, not as a mistake to be erased, but as a choice he was finally brave enough to own. By the time the situation spilled beyond the company's walls, There was no turning back. What began as internal pressure transformed into quiet inquiries from industry journalists, cautious emails from partners, and an unmistakable shift in how meetings were scheduled and decisions delayed. The board had hoped to contain the issue through attrition and silence, but silence had become impossible. Ethan felt the change most acutely in the way people spoke to him now, carefully, respectfully, as if he had crossed an invisible line and could no longer be dismissed as background noise. When the mediation session was finally set, held in a neutral office far from the gleaming headquarters, the room felt charged with history and consequence. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, board representatives framed concerns as principles, and Ethan listened, refusing to shrink, articulating his position with a clarity forged through weeks of fear and resolve. He did not argue for special treatment, only for fairness, for the recognition that responsibility did not equate to misconduct, and when Victoria spoke, her voice steady and unyielding, the room shifted perceptibly. She did not defend him as a lover or a subordinate, but as a professional whose work stood on its own merit, and in doing so, she forced the issue into the open where it could no longer be distorted. The outcome was not a clean victory, but it was not defeat either. Ethan's role was formally terminated under restructuring, yet the terms were revised, public, and carefully worded, stripping the board of its ability to imply wrongdoing. He walked out of that building for the last time with his head high, uncertain but unbroken, aware that while he had lost stability, he had gained something far rarer, self-respect. The days that followed were frightening in their quiet, resumes sent, interviews scheduled, routines disrupted, yet each evening he returned home to Noah, whose pride in his father's courage shone brighter than any professional title. Victoria's path was no easier. Oversight tightened, her autonomy constrained, but public response shifted in her favor, sparking conversations about leadership, accountability, and the impossible standards placed on those who dared to be human in positions of power. Slowly, allies emerged, investors who valued transparency over control, voices that reframed the narrative the board had tried to suppress. Through it all, Ethan and Victoria remained connected, not through secrecy or fear, but through deliberate choice, navigating an unfamiliar dynamic shaped by mutual respect rather than imbalance. As her pregnancy progressed, the future that once felt like a threat began to take shape as something tangible, something that demanded preparation rather than avoidance. Ethan involved Noah in small ways, letting him feel the baby kick during one cautious visit, watching as curiosity replaced uncertainty, and in those moments he understood that family was not defined by timing or perfection, but by presence. The final reckoning came when the board, facing sustained pressure and internal fractures, announced a leadership transition plan that restored Victoria's authority and acknowledged missteps without naming them outright. It was not the apology she deserved, but it was an admission, and it marked the end of a chapter defined by fear. Months later, on a quiet morning filled with soft light and nervous anticipation, Ethan stood in a hospital hallway holding Noah's hand as Victoria labored behind closed doors, the weight of everything that had led them there pressing gently but firmly against his chest. When the nurse finally emerged with a smile and an invitation, the world narrowed to a single moment. He stepped into the room, saw Victoria exhausted but radiant, and met the tiny, fragile life that had rewritten his story. In that instant, all the questions that had haunted him fell away, replaced by a profound certainty that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stay despite it. The future remained unwritten, messy, and uncertain. But as Ethan looked at his children, one sleeping peacefully, the other watching with awe, he knew he had made the only choice that mattered. He had not run. He had stood still, faced the truth, and allowed it to change him, and in doing so, he had found not the life he had planned, but the one he was meant to live. The months after the birth did not unfold like a triumphant epilogue, but like the slow, deliberate settling of dust after a storm, each day revealing what had truly changed and what wounds still needed time to close. Ethan learned quickly that courage did not end with one decisive stand. It had to be practiced daily, in quieter ways that no one applauded. His mornings were no longer dictated by corporate calendars, but by two children who needed him in different, equally demanding ways. Noah with his questions and growing awareness, the baby with cries that cut through sleep and reminded Ethan how fragile an absolute responsibility could feel. There were moments, standing in the kitchen at dawn with a bottle warming and a backpack waiting by the door, when exhaustion pressed so heavily on him that fear whispered again, asking whether he had traded one impossible life for another. But then there were moments when Noah gently corrected him on how to hold the baby, or when the infant's tiny fingers wrapped instinctively around his own, and those doubts softened into something steadier, something that felt like purpose. Victoria's life transformed more visibly, though no less painfully. The restoration of her authority did not erase the months of scrutiny or the scars left by betrayal from people she had once trusted, and leadership felt different now, heavier but also more honest. She no longer performed invincibility. Instead, she spoke openly about limits, about accountability, about the cost of pretending to be untouched by consequence. The shift unsettled some, inspired others, and while she remained powerful, her power no longer relied on distance. For the first time, she allowed herself to be seen not just as a CEO, but as a mother, learning in real time, fumbling through sleepless nights and quiet guilt over missed meetings and postponed calls. Ethan watched her navigate this new balance with a respect that deepened into something calmer and more enduring than the intensity that had once bound them. Their relationship did not resolve into a fairy tale certainty. It grew slowly, shaped by honesty and restraint, by shared responsibility rather than reckless escape. They argued, they doubted, they renegotiated boundaries more than once, but they did so openly, without the secrecy that had once poisoned everything. In time, Ethan found work again, not at the same level or with the same prestige, but with people who valued integrity over convenience, and while the pay was lower and the future less predictable, he discovered that his sense of worth no longer rose and fell with external approval. The man who had once survived by staying small learned to occupy space without apology. Noah adapted in ways that amazed him, moving from cautious acceptance to genuine affection, proudly introducing his sibling to classmates and correcting adults who stumbled over the word or family, insisting with absolute confidence that families came in many shapes and still worked just fine. Watching his son grow into that certainty felt like a quiet redemption, proof that the fear Ethan carried did not have to define the next generation. There were still nights when memories surfaced uninvited, of his late wife, of the life he thought he would always live, of the version of himself that believed safety could be engineered through avoidance. But those memories no longer carried the same sharpness. They became part of a larger story rather than its ending. On a crisp autumn afternoon nearly a year after everything had unraveled, Ethan stood in a park watching Noah teach his sibling how to crawl on the grass, Victoria sitting beside him with tired eyes and an unguarded smile, and he realized that balance had returned not as control but as acceptance. The future remained uncertain, shaped by choices that would continue to demand courage, but it no longer felt like something to outrun. As the sun dipped lower and laughter drifted across the park, Ethan understood that one whispered confession had not destroyed his life as he once feared. It had stripped away the illusion that life could ever be perfectly contained. In its place, it had given him something harder and truer. A life built on presence, accountability, and the quiet strength to stay when leaving would have been easier. And as he gathered his family and headed home, he knew that whatever challenges waited ahead, he would meet them not as a man defined by a mistake, but as someone who had chosen again and again to stand and face the truth.